An assault on democracy, never again. It's the theme 1 year after March 2, 2020. We're March 2, 2021. Looking at the events of the past year, what followed, where are we now, and where are we heading? I am Leron Brummel. Thanks very much for joining me. We restart the discussion, rather. It started around 11 this morning. We've had 3 panels since then. Tonight I have the privilege of keeping my company and, of course, sharing views. Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs Senior Counsel Anil Nandlal. I've got Kaitro News Editor Ruel Johnson. And I've got columnist, no stranger to us, Freddie Kissoon. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. How are you all this evening?
We're fine, thank you. Very good. Thanks for the invite.
Freddie doesn't want to venture in.
I'm always good. I'm always good.
You're always good. Good to do. The discussion started. There has been a lot said within the past 2 hours. The president, of course, beginning that last night, announcing the order of democracy. And it's been a feature of his speeches since he's been sworn in August, that never again will we go through, as a country, as a people, as a nation, go through what we went through for the last year. There is some amount of stability coming back into it. Persons are now settling in back to regular, normal lives as brothers and sisters, as one people, one nation, one destiny in Ghana. So let me start off with the age. And I've got a panel of gentlemen who I can ask a question and then get up and leave. And I'll come back and check you guys in an hour, and they will continue this discussion without me even being here. So AG, let's start with you. 1 year on, are you satisfied with the pace at which steps are being taken by the government to correct that wrong?
Well, before we get to that, I believe that we should examine the wrong, because only that can lay the platform to go where you want to take me. In modern civilization, there is a nexus that exists between civilized society, democracy, and by extension, of course, development. A quick and cursory examination of modern civilization would lead to the conclusion that there has been stagnation, there is underdevelopment, there is social immobility, wherever there is the absence of democracy and freedom. And what was under threat 1 year ago in Guyana was democracy and freedom. In any country's history, there are going to be many defining moments. Among the defining moments in Guyana's contemporary history certainly would be the events surrounding March 2nd general and regional elections, and more particular, the events which ensued those elections. And fortunately, and I guess we will go into the events themselves as the discourse continues, but Guyana was able to survive that ordeal, and we have graduated from that. And today we can sit here as civilized, intelligent human beings and have a conversation. Why? Because we as a people did not succumb to those who wanted to destroy this country using race, using violence, using fraud, sabotaging the electoral process, and employing various methods. Our people showed a degree of maturity. We had standing with us the entire country locally, excepting those who can be described as the saboteurs. We had standing with us the region. We had standing with us the diplomatic community. We had standing with us all the international organizations of worth. And we had 100 countries across the globe standing on the side of freedom, standing on the side of democracy. And in the end, we prevailed. And we are now having this discussion.
We're not having a discussion. Let me toss it over to Ruel, and then we move on to Mr. Kisoon Freddy. At that time, Ruel, you would have been a member of one of the smaller parties inside of it, the TCI. What?
What I want to do is first address, I think, what the AG has addressed is that I've written about, and one of the reasons I was part of a smaller party is I've written about the dysfunction of partisan politics in Ghana. Freddie's written about it, and we need to go some way into correcting those fundamental systems. That said, however, what happened after March 2nd was something that went beyond the pale of partisan politics. It was an attack on the fundamental structures of a country. If a country's electoral systems by which you determine not only who governs as the executive, but within the republic, who represents the people directly in the National Assembly, then the entire concept of the country is meaningless. The laws in themselves in general are meaningless. If it is that somebody could, or any group of people, could fundamentally deconstruct and within the glare of the international community, within the glare of the people themselves. So from my perspective, that is, I see assault on democracy and never again, and I usually cringe at this sort of slogans, etc. But that's really what it was, and it should not happen again, ever. So that's the thrust of what I want to say here tonight.
Let me bring you in here, Freddie.
Thanks for having me here. I am comforted in the reality that NCN has invited me, and I think there is a obligatory preface to my contribution proper on the year gone by and the election disaster. And that is, I would hope this is the beginning of a new horizon in which the state and its institutions will be put to the disposal of the Guyanese people. And therefore, in that context, I hope NCN will also, I don't want to say reach out, that is a different concept that is quite different to making NCN available to people that do not share the values and the emanations that will emerge from this discussion tonight. Obviously, I think the chairman, you as the editor, and the manager of NCN will have to be careful who you invite. Obviously, some names come to mind. People would sit down here and talk about racism and maybe get into the mode of cussing down. Notwithstanding that, I hope NCN will reach out to people who do not share our views. How you arrange that format, your selectees, that's for you to decide. But I hope you do. There are people out there, significant among the people out there, who believe that their leaders should be given a chance to speak on NCN. That, I feel, was my obligation, and that's why I called it an obligatory preface. Now for my contribution proper. I am relatively, all three of you are relatively young in comparison to me. And therefore, your suffering of a country that had unelected leaders would be vicarious in the sense that you would have heard your parents at the breakfast table said, "Oh God, the searching cars every night at Madarini for banned items." You would have heard your parents said, "How can they deny that great scholar Rodney a job at UG? You know they stop." You would have heard that because you were pretty young. But I was a freshman at UG, picketing for Rodney. So when I sat in that studio, Kaicho studio, not on March the 2nd, nothing a year ago on this date was happening. There were a couple of skirmishes here and there. I remember Aniel had a problem with Amna Ali, and he telling Amna Ali, "I don't know what you're talking about at Monrepo." But the real impending disaster was March the 3rd and March the 4th. So we have to zero in on those days. My contribution on this program tonight is to describe for a country whose population, 70%, are under 40 years of age. Therefore, they would not know what unelected power does to a country. I've lived through those days. I have suffered through those days. Thousands of people that I knew have suffered through those days. I suspect people like Anil Parents, who had some retail store in Annandale, would have felt the wrath of Burnham and the banned stuff and searching every particular shop to see if they had banned stuff, etc. But when one thinks of March the 3rd and March the 4th, in the context of those traumas one experienced in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was like if your world was ending. I remember in that studio on March the 3rd, I chose to, Glenn Lal and Adam Harris and a whole set of guests, young PPP who are parliamentarians now. They are talking about this thing, and I am just silent because they do not know what was going through my mind. 1968, I was a polling agent, young little teenager at St. Thomas More School in Dublin Street, the primary school I've been to. And I saw what happened the night when polling was closed. I was 16 then. I was 26. I was 36. I was 46. And I saw what happened when I was 16. And you mean to tell me in 2021, a married man of 42 years with a kid in her late 20s, I had to go through that again? Now that is where my delineation and my adumbrations this evening will differ from the legal mind of Aninandalal, the politician who contested the election. I want to talk of going to the abyss after 1992 when we cleared up those vulgarities, profanities, bestialities in politics. That was coming back again. And in that radio studio, I decided it isn't going to happen once I have a pen and once I have a voice. I am not going to single out myself because I believe there are hundreds of thousands who join people like me. And of course, Anil was ubiquitous, incessantly ubiquitous. But we said that was not going to happen again. And in my own little corner, when I went home, when I walked my dog at the back of Giftland and there was nobody because there was curfew on, I said, that isn't going to happen to my daughter's country.
I appreciate the tone at which you come and how you start having that discussion. AG, a lot said from the time you started, the time we come back to you at this point. And we don't have all that time to examine everything in detail as it is. Freddie pointed out March 3rd, March 4th, you were there, and he made reference to being in Kaitro News Studio at that point in time. In your mind?
The events are fresh in my mind as if it occurred yesterday. I left, the tabulation had begun. I was left in charge of the People's Progressive Party team of tabulators in that glass room at Ashbin. I say glass room for a reason. There were dozens of people outside looking on into the room, but only authorized persons were permitted to enter the room. So Mr. Mingo began the exercise, and the task was mine to plan for my team a shift system. So I inquired. I asked Mr. Mingo respectfully to pause. He was using the statements of poll, and everything was going smoothly. That was about 8 p.m. the night. So I inquired of him whether he will continue the entire night. He said to me, Mr. Nandlal, you are quite experienced in this thing. And you know when we start this tabulation exercise, we don't stop until it is completed. So I told him thank you, and I stepped out to make a phone call to ready my second shift, which will begin at 12 midnight, to come and take over from this shift. And I left to go home to change and to come back. I live in Bel Air Park. From Ashmin Building to Bel Air Park is less than 10 minutes. As I arrived in my house and I sat in my balcony, the phone rang. And I was informed that Mr. Mingo suddenly reported that he was not feeling well, and he abruptly ended the exercise, and that it will resume the next morning. I was alarmed, but we didn't think so deeply into it. The next morning, we turned up at the scheduled time. Mingo could not have been found. Then after a long wait, we were told that he fell ill and that he has to be taken to the hospital. And we were told first he was not in the building. Then he was in the building. And then this ambulance appeared in front of Ashmin Building. And Mingo appeared coming down the step in a wheelchair with some medical instruments plugged into him, including a breathing apparatus over his mouth. And he was whisked away to the hospital. Then there was a protracted delay, and then 2 other persons began the tabulation exercise. And they started to use not the statements of poll, but some other documents. And then the problem began. And then Mingo came back and resumed, and he started to use the same document. And we couldn't stop him. Claudette Singh locked herself up in a room. She was not coming out. I saw the attention of Myers. She came down. She said she can't interfere. Lowenfield could not have been found. And this thing going at an alarming speed. And then I left. And I went home. And I believe that this is the most defining moment. It was the game changer. I went home, and I wrote out in my handwriting an application. I didn't have a typist. Me and my driver alone, Riaz Holadar. I didn't have a typist or anything. Wrote with my handwriting. Call a judge and ask him if he would hear an urgent application on my behalf orally. The judge was reluctant. I persuaded him, point out the law to him, all on the telephone, that this thing is possible. The law provides for it. I don't have the time to come to you with a written application, as is the norm. But I can give you an undertaking, as the law provides, that within reasonable time, the oral application I make will be reduced into writing and present to you for filing. After some arguments, he agreed to hear me. And I went to the court and I made the application. He asked me to walk with me an order of the court. By that time, I got a junior lawyer to come with me, and he typed out the order that I wanted from the court, a draft order. I presented the oral arguments, and the judge granted the order in writing, because I can't go and serve an oral order. I had to get that order. And that was the order, in the name of Riaz Holadar, that stopped Mingo from... By that time, Mingo had already made a declaration, though he did not complete the tabulation. He aborted the tabulation, though he was tabulating with that fraudulent document, that spreadsheet. As the pressure grew, he aborted that process, ran upstairs to the top of the building, and declared the results. As a result, I had to go and amend the court order, no longer stopping him, but to set aside the declaration that he made on the ground that it was unlawful, it was not done in accordance with the act, and an order setting it aside. And that order was granted. And I got several copies of that order, picked up the marshals from the High Court, and walked into Splashman building with that order and served it. And that's when Justice Singh again didn't come out of the room to receive the order. And that's when Glenn Lal and a whole set of police had to go and break the door open. But I served on all the relevant parties there. And that single order is what changed the entire nature of what occurred. Because that order had a return date. It was, I believe, a Friday that I got that order. And the Chief Justice, I think, fixed the matter, took the matter from Justice Singh and fixed it for the following Saturday morning for us to go to court.
That's it.
And it was that order that eventually was confirmed by the Chief Justice. By that time, we had long arguments. Other parties came in, and we spent about a week or two in the court. And that order was eventually confirmed by the Chief Justice. And then is when the Chief Justice explained how the tabulation must be done and that you must use the statements of poll as the basis. And after we left that court and went back to Splashman building, Mingo was in that court. The Chief Justice made him stand up and explain to him, using various examples with her hands, how to hold up the statements of poll, whether he wants to project it on a screen. But whatever he did, it must be the statement of poll that formed the basis of the tabulation. Yet that gentleman went back into Splashman building and continued to refuse to use that statement of poll as the basis. I had to leave the court, run over there again, point out to him, you just left the Chief Justice and you are violating our order, and I'm going to jail you for contempt. Then is when he aborted the process and says that he will resume at GCOM headquarters. It was Friday the 13th. When we went to GCOM headquarters, they erect police barriers all over and had PNC supporters blocking both sides, stoning reporters and harassing people who assembled there. And they allowed only one person to go in. And way in the night, he used a bed sheet or something. And nobody knew whether it was the statements of poll or not that he was projecting on the screen, because he was doing it so quickly that those who were only one person per party was allowed. And they couldn't collate with what he was doing. But he never stopped, although they raised objections. And that is when Carol Joseph beat that gentleman from Anug party, the fair-skinned guy,
Jonathan
Yearwood. And then they proceeded to declare the results again that night, Friday the 13th. Saturday morning, we had to go back to court. By that time, they fumigated the High Court. The court was held at Diamond. And it was while that proceeding was ongoing that we got the news that Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, issued a statement to say that Mr. Granger had agreed for the recount. And let me tell you something that a few persons know. In that court were Alexander, Trotman, and Corbin, chairman of the commissioners of GCOM. When they heard that a recount was agreed upon to take place, I have never seen men so angry. They came out of the court and they were pacing the whole compound, almost screaming on the phone, whoever they were speaking with. They were visibly upset that a recount was agreed upon. And then, of course, when the recount was to start, you had them stall it by fumigating this entire building. And then they got Yolita Moore to go to the court to file proceedings to stop the recount. Their own candidate. And of course, I can go on, but you have other persons here. But that is how the story unfolded.
You went ahead, and I'm now about to ask Ruel, at what point did the TCI at that point in the other smaller parties get involved? Because then it was painted that all of the parties, and that was one of the disadvantages of being a smaller party. Then it said, well, hey, all of you guys are now PPP supporters. Now you're showing your true colors. At what point you got involved, and how did you... it's difficult to judge it. But how do you stand a ground having a tag assigned to you?
First of all, let me address one thing. To bounce off what Freddie said earlier. With regard to the state and acceptance of dissenting views or differing views in the state media, I should say, first of all, when I was originally invited here, one of the preconditions were that an invitation would be extended to the opposition similarly, because this is a serious panel, particularly with somebody like AG representing government's interest. I understand the invitation was extended but refused or ignored. So let me just say that thing. Now, with regard to what TCI's position was, first of all, we were a legitimate party that fielded a list of candidates for the elections. So we were stakeholders on our own right. With regard to perception of alliances, etc., that didn't matter. As this thing progressed, there was a clear delineation of what was right and what was wrong. So at that point in time, everybody who saw what took place, as Eugene and Lau just described, who were not part of the then administration, knew what was wrong. Not just morally wrong, but very basically what was procedurally wrong. Rhonda Lam, who represented us and was a presidential candidate, she stuck through the entire day. That when they moved from Ashman's
building
to Become Center with and had the spreadsheet and the bed sheet. And when that unfolded, we were in contact. We were not supposed to be in contact with phone. Because that was one of the other restrictions, by the way.
Yeah.
She was describing a process in which the bed sheet was several meters away from the where everybody else was. The lighting was low, and even through that, and the process was so fast that she couldn't reconcile even with the SOPs that we had in our possession. And even with that, what was displayed on the screen showed clear manipulation. So you would have had SOPs, which seemed to be genuine, but there was alterations that were visible, which is why they proceeded so quickly with the thing. At that point in time, and this goes to something that has to be fundamentally explored here. The pretension is that GCOM is one entity, and the political parties are a different entity. At that point in time, and it was borne out subsequently, if it is that you have agents of an entity putting forward one narrative and manipulating reality to show a narrative, and you have a political machinery, particularly an incumbent government, that is in support of and signing off on that, literally signing off on the narrative, then you have the fundamental danger of the basic machinery of establishing the democracy being under assault. So at that point in time, it wasn't a question of whether we supported one side or the other. Certainly, the then opposition had the sort of resources, had the sort of talent. We didn't have an Nandlan on our team. So it was a matter of supporting what was right against what was blatantly wrong at a fundamental level. So we weren't too bothered about labels, and I'm not part of the formal party structure now, but I don't think anybody's too bothered about it, particularly after the vindication of what happened with the court thing and how everything turned out.
Freddie, soon you looked at this entire process with your pen, and your pen has been known to get people upset or rub them in some way. Reference has been made to the process being violated, the process, the manipulation in that process. With your pen and making the changes or advocating for the changes, are you satisfied with what you have seen so far? And we jump ahead now to government being sworn in on August the 2nd, going forward? Are you satisfied with what you've seen so far in terms of making adjustments to a system that was assaulted?
No, that's an ongoing process. I can't answer that question because I think it needs to have more shape on it. One can only be satisfied, and again the age difference comes in here. I have seen too much. When I listened to Aninandalal's description, which for want of a better word was graphic, that was a step by step. I've been through that thing with Harold Bollers as the chairman of the Elections Commission. I stood with Father Morrison and Colin Smith, the current editor of the Catholic, and we were together. And I'd be lying to say I wasn't faithful. When people began to assault GCOM headquarters, which at that time was in Cole Street, I would never forget there were two Caucasian cameramen. And those men were filming the pelting, stood up, filming people pelting. And I was wondering if they were not afraid, the people would pelt them too. So when Anil was saying that, and then he made mention of Carol Joseph assaulting an election candidate, that was an atavistic reversion to the 60s, to the 70s, to the 80s. Again, I say you guys were pretty young to see what was happening in 73. 2 guys got killed. The soldiers shot 2 guys and killed them. Bolanot and Jagan. So, when that description there was known to the world, because people were filming it. People were filming what went on inside GCOM. People were filming. This is the age of the smartphone, where you can bring a polar bear in the Arctic Ocean, and someone could be seeing it in a tropical country. Now that was what so many of us decided, not only the older folks like us, but the younger people who never saw that before decided that that shouldn't happen. I live right next door here to this building. And when I saw those young people guarding the ballot boxes, I'm driving in at Giffland Mall, where I walk my dog in the afternoon. There was curfew there. And I said, I knew this wasn't 68, this wasn't 73. Now, all along in that studio and the runaway train that Anil was describing, I had oxymoronic emotions. I must say I was pessimistic because Guyana has had 70, 80 years of trials and tribulations. I was a little boy hearing about how they treat us at Caribbean airports. I got married and went to Caribbean airport and see how they were treating our people. So I would be dishonest to say I wasn't disheartened. And people driving in at Giffland to go to the home called Demerara Estate would stop. But I was also very optimistic because I knew this was a different opposition there. There were 10 opposition parties. This wasn't the pacifism of Chedi Jagan. And this wasn't the world as it was in the 60s and 70s. They were rigging this thing in a way that was an assault on the dignity of every human. You know, I believe humans are flawed in many ways. But I believe why civilization has lasted for thousands of years is because despite those flaws, we are essentially people driven by conscience. And that is why less than 1% of the people of this world, 7 billion people, are in jail. Because they have a conscience and they don't do wrong. But there are some themes Anil touched on that need to be expanded because they provide knowledge knowledge to the Guyanese people that didn't know what was happening, and they were given false narratives by the AFC, the PNC, and their surrogates. He said when it was announced how to agree to a recount, Alexander and them were the epitome of uncontrollable rage. That's because not of Granger's doing. That is not because Granger agreed to a recount. These are the hidden dimensions, the invisible dimensions of the election rigging that need to be brought out. Granger didn't decide on his own volition with existential choice for a recount. Behind all these things that were going on in Ashman Building, in Kingston, in the streets, there were strong external forces saying to the PNC, we are not going to tolerate this. And I am saying that Mr. Granger did not originate the idea of a recount. And I am 1,000% sure of that, and I have the confidential information about that. It was suggested to him by Mia Motley through the Americans, and he knew it was a fait accompli. He knew it was a fait accompli, but he had thoughts in his head. So he said yes. And when he said yes, Alexander, as he said in the quote, gave it away with his anger, because he knew that was the game changer, the recount, and therefore they had to guillotine the game changer. So from the time in that court in Diamond, when Alexander got into this irrationality, the game changer was on. The game changer was on for both sides. For the side of democracy, that the recount will not be stopped, and for them, that they have to stop the game changer. That is why the man, Granger said he couldn't stop a lady, a citizen, from bringing a court case. But he could have stopped the PNC's lawyer from taking the lady's case. So Yulita Moore filed a writ to stop the recount, and the PNC's lawyer, a PNC's candidate, was taking Yulita Moore's case. He didn't say to her, man, I can't do this. My leader has asked for the recount.
Yulita Moore herself was a candidate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A original candidate. So,
Yeah.
but I want to get back before I end up like Anil talking too long. I want to get back. I want to look at some of the themes that Anil spoke of. You see, what this election has done, and you asked me if I'm satisfied, and I said, no, not as yet. I'm satisfied that the people who rightfully should have won the election have won, and has nothing personal to do with me.
Yeah.
Nothing. I don't know 3/4 of the people who have inherited power and who are in parliament. But that is a country's right. That is a country's right. The thing that I'm not satisfied with, and I'm hoping I am not in the business of flattering people. I am too much of a crazy person since I was small to flatter people. But I hope Anil, as the Attorney General, would just relentlessly spend his time changing the system so we would not have that kind of thing we witness, that you can't find statements of poll, you can't find this document. The thing about I talked about the recounting with Granger. The other thing that needs to be brought out, and this involves you yourself now as the NCN editing, is when they surrounded the GCOM headquarters in Kingston, and PNC and AFC thugs were beating people up. The Guyana Press Association issued a statement saying reporters are being beaten up. by opposition parties, which would include the Citizen Initiative. So Johnson would have to tell us tonight why his party was beating up media people. I'm a media person, and I would resent Johnson sending people to beat up my colleagues in the media. So he would have to deal with that. But I am satisfied that democracy has prevailed. I am satisfied our votes have been counted. The 115,000 that Lowenfield wanted to remove, including me, my daughter, my wife, and my friends, I'm satisfied that prevailed. I am not satisfied that we are out of the woods yet. We have to bring in a new landscape of electoral behavior that is tightly legalistic. And I read that Anil is saying that is in the works.
Yeah.
And so we have to stop what happened in Ashman Building and in High Street.
Let me toss it.
All right, before we go, so I prefer if the show would end, because I'm looking at the time as well.
Are you looking at your
On,
time?
with Mr. Nandlao. So I want to very briefly touch on two things. With regard to where the international pressures came from, certainly in terms of holding the fire to the then executive, I'm sure there was international pressure. I'm sure that there was international intervention at levels that the general public was not aware of.
Would not know.
The caution, however, is that, and this is part of the narrative that is currently being peddled, is that you hear stuff like that the current administration has been installed as opposed to elected by the will of the people. So there's an extrapolation of international influence as a standard behind the scenes when it comes to pending crises, which is a diplomat and pick up a phone and say, you know what, make this thing right, make sure that the law is followed, or make sure that this option that would carve a way out is followed. That is distinctly different from Russians coming and hijacking the elections, or any sort of grand international conspiracy that involved the Americans, the British, everybody in the Commonwealth, some people from the African Union, and CARICOM conspiring to remove a legitimately elected government. That did not happen. So that's the caution I would say. I agree with Freddie, and I agree that I've heard the AG speak about it. The electoral rules have to change towards greater transparency. There is no reason that at any point in time, GCOM's commissioners should not have had legitimate statements of poll to say, look at these are in the public, put these in the public domain. I don't see the reason for that sort of retaining alternative. If it is that a political party is saying, yeah, our statement of poll said this, and the other one said this, the control should be with GCOM, and GCOM should be able, and the fact it should be an automatic process in which the statements of poll are made. This is a public documents. If they are put in front of the places of poll, then there's no reason that subsequent to that they should be under lock and key and out of the scrutiny of GCOM. So that has to change. But that has to do with electoral law reform. In conjunction with that, the AG is also chair of the Standing Committee on Constitutional Reform. And we have to speak of these things in terms of the overall issue of constitutional reform, including, I believe, to be a more representative democracy, which we get rid of the system and all that. But that's for down the road. And electoral reform has to be tied to that sort of deeper representative democracy. And when we get that, we don't get the sort of indecency which emanates from primarily a handful of people because they control a list or they control a system or a political party inordinately. So that's my final thing.
AG, over to you as Ruel has wrapped.
I wanted
has wrapped this
to
up.
begin by adding to what Mr. Kisoon said, supporting his thesis that Mr. Granger was most reluctant to the agreement for the recount. Mr. Granger then, after agreeing, and after the public statement came out, how he come to agree, Freddie has explained, demanded that we must do an aid memoir to capture that arrangement that he apparently entered into with Miss Mia Motley. That was another delaying tactic that the public doesn't know.
Yeah.
That aid memoir was a 3-line document. Copy came from Barbados, examined by Mr. Jagdeo. Mr. Jagdeo sent it to me as his legal advisor. I made 1 or 2 very formal corrections. And in 1 hour, we were ready to sign. Mr. Granger spent 3 days claiming that he's seeking legal advice. That was another mechanism that they used to delay the beginning of the recount, while Yolita Moore lawyers were afforded that opportunity to prepare the court documents. Mr. Jagdeo eventually drove, right? We were in this compound bringing in the ballot boxes in containers when Mr. Jagdeo drove and handed to Mr. LaRoque over there his signed copy of the aid memoir, because we couldn't wait on Mr. Granger anymore. 3 days had passed, and he can't get legal advice from 6 lawyers he has in that party or more on a 3-line document. I don't think he ever submitted that aid memoir. So I wanted to say that to get that out of the way. The second point that I want to make is that I have just come out of a budget debate. And every speaker on the side of APNU+AFC stood in that parliament and told the Guyanese people that what they experienced subsequent to March the 2nd did not happen. That they did not attempt to steal elections. That Mingo did not attempt to pervert the results. That Lowenfield did not attempt to pervert the results. That they are the victims of fraud. That they were robbed. That the PPP were the bad people. That is what they have been telling people all the time. From that moment. So we still have that issue to deal with. How do you treat with that when the major opposition party in the country continues to mislead their supporters? They told their supporters that they are going to unseat the PPP government in the shortest possible time with 2 elections petition. One was heard less than 3 months that it was filed and dismissed. You know why? Because they did not even serve it on their own presidential candidate. The epitome of incompetence. But they hold on to that irrational, clumsy, foolish logic that everyone saw for themselves. What transpired? It is recorded in permanent form, in video, in writing, in still pictures. And they are still telling a story out there that is completely the opposite of what people know, what we experience in this country. And they present themselves as a credible opposition, a credible alternative government. So you have that problem. The people of Guyana have to take responsibility and have to punish these persons who continue to lacerate their intellect and their memory. This thing is still fresh in people's minds. You saw 15,000 dead people voted. Your polling agent was at every polling station, signing off on every statement of poll, thereby confirming the accuracy of that document. And then you want to denounce and deprecate that very document? Why? Simply because you want a story to tell? You don't want to accept the truth of what is in the box? So documents apparently were missing. I was responsible for that area. The presiding officers were given instructions by Mingo, he was a returning officer,
To remove the documents.
to put the documents in a different bag. I drew it to Mingo's attention the very election night. Mingo told me, don't worry, Mr. Nandlal, I have received them. I have them. I have given it to Lowenfield. I called Lowenfield that same night. Lowenfield confirmed that he has received the documents for all of those 40 boxes. When the issue of the documents being missing was raised here at this recount, right in this building, I went up to Lowenfield on this corridor, the western extremity of this corridor. And I said, you told me election night that you have all the documents. You picked them up from Mingo. They were put there separately by mistake. He said, yes, they are in a place at Collingin. When I went out there and I made it public under that tent with the reporters, the next day he said he's not going to have conversations with me because I am reporting out there what he's telling me. I said, I don't want private conversations with you. I was not asking you a secret. I was asking you about the voting documents of this country. They're public record. And you told me that they're stored with GCOM materials at GCOM, at Collingin Storage Center. So all this foolishness when they're talking about documents are missing is absolute fabrication. But let us assume for one moment that a document is missing. That one presiding officer did not put some formal document in that ballot box. Are you telling me that the law is such an ass that it will nullify all those votes in that box because an administrative officer did not do his or her job? Is that the law? That 40,000 people will lose their franchise through no fault of theirs because an election officer was negligent in putting or not putting a paper in a box. These people believe that people are fools or the law is an ass. That is what their second, that is what their election petition is about. Anyhow, in terms of the reform, let me say that the reform will manifest itself in two forms. One, you have the constitutional reforms. That will be a protracted exercise because that requires 2/3 majority. And you have the rigors there. Their support is necessary to get anything passed in the parliament by a 2/3 majority. And of course, the rigors will not support reforms to make the process transparent because they are hoping for another opportunity to thief the election. So you have to deal with that issue. However, we have a simple majority, and 90% of the reforms to which Joel has referred to can be done by a simple majority. For example, when voting is done, simultaneous with posting of the statements of poll on the door of the polling station, you upload it
electronically,
publicly, upload it on a website established for that purpose. And fortunately, all the lacunas and the loopholes and the weaknesses in the law that they have exploited are still fresh in our minds. So we have a tabulation of them. I have already begun the exercise. As I speak now, a unit has been established and we are working towards correcting them. And hopefully we will correct them before the next elections. But it may not be completed. If it's not completed, it's going to be an ongoing. Next election meaning local
government elections, because that's the question.
Certainly, we are not going back to an elections unless we correct all these things, including the recruitment process for staff at GCOM, so that you do not have a Lowenfield and a Mingo and a Myers. And, those are technical issues that you have to think and come up with innovative formulations to guard against that type of thing. But systematically, certainly the system as outlined in the legislation is going to be checked section by section and all the loose screws tightened as you go. That is a work in progress.
Attorney General, Minister of Legal Affairs, Anil Nandlal, thanks very much for joining us, as well as Ruel Johnson, member of the TCI at the time of a year ago, as well as editor at Kaitra News. And of course, Freddie Kissoon, columnist, thanks very much for joining us here. I was hoping to steal some more time, but stay with us. This discussion continues. Edward Lane comes up with a few more heavyweights for the next few hours. This is the assault on democracy, never again, looking back at events of the past year. I'm Leron Brummel. Stay with us. We're back in just a bit.
Being in the 21st century and witnessing live the amount of ungodly things that occurred after election, well, I don't believe that no country in the 21st century should have to suffer undemocratic practice from any government whatsoever. So that is what basically gave me the motivation to get involved and be active in the fight to safeguard Guyana's fragile democracy. They prolonged 5 months to get the election results, which in by 72 hours max. And then more so, the statement of poll were there. By election night, everyone would have gotten about 90% of the results in already. So we all know who won. And to know that a few persons in GCOM and government officials, sadly, held this country hostage for 5 months. And we should never see anything whatsoever like that ever again. By no government, no election, no public servant, and no election official.
Well, I cast my vote on March 2nd, 2020 for democracy, for the PPP, who is a strong supporter of democracy, expecting a result within 72 hours, having saw it going on and on, court, back court, out, in, out, back and forth. So I decided to join the guidance of democracy to protect the ballot boxes. AM to PM, PM to AM, we're out there guiding the boxes to make sure everybody vote counts. The suffering of the Guyanese people who suffered for a long 5 months, lost their business, lost their car, lost their home, their jobs in a pandemic. It was totally wrong. We never would like to see that again, not in Guyana.
What motivated me to get in a fight for democracy is the wrong things that I saw was going on, right? And I realized that democracy was stolen away from the people, right? So if democracy is stolen from the people, I'm a concerned citizen, right? I don't want that to happen. So I decided not to fight for democracy. And fighting for democracy, it pay off great well. We is a democracy country. We are a democratic country. And if you have one side trying to carry away everything, it's not good for the people. I don't want to see that happen again with no party, PNC, the PPP, or no other party, regardless of who in power. If an election comes and you lose, come out and give somebody another chance. This is what we want in this country. Don't fight and you know you lose and you keep fighting and fighting and doing all kind of stuff and people getting damaged and people getting hurt and all this kind of thing. It's bad for the country. You're destroying the country and you're also destroying the people them.
Well, I cast my vote on March 2nd, 2020 for democracy, for the PPP, who is a strong supporter of democracy, expecting a result within 72 hours, having saw it going on and on, court, out, in, out, back and forth. So I decided to join the guidance of democracy to protect the ballot boxes. AM to PM, PM to AM, we're out there guiding the boxes to make sure everybody vote counts. The suffering of the Guyanese people who suffered for a long 5 months, lost their business, lost their car, lost their home, their jobs in a pandemic. It was totally wrong. We never would like to see that again, not in Guyana.
Being in the 21st century and witnessing live the amount of ungodly things that occurred after election, well, I don't believe that no country in the 21st century should have to suffer undemocratic practice from any government whatsoever. So that is what basically gave me the motivation to get involved and be active in the fight to safeguard Guyana's fragile democracy. They prolonged 5 months to get the election results, which in by 72 hours max. And then more so, the statement of poll were there. By election night, everyone would have gotten about 90% of the results in already. So we all know who won. And to know that a few persons in GCOM and government officials, sadly, held this country hostage for 5 months. And we should never see anything whatsoever like that ever again. By no government, no election, no public servant, and no election official.
What motivates me to get in a fight for democracy is the wrong things that I saw was going on, right? And I realized that democracy was stolen away from the people, right? So if democracy is stolen from the people, I'm a concerned citizen, right? I don't want that to happen. So I decided not to fight for democracy. And fighting for democracy, it pay off great well. We is a democracy country. We are a democratic country. And if you have one side trying to carry away everything, it's not good for the people. I don't want to see that happen again with no party, PNC, the PPP, or no other party, regardless of who in power. If an election comes and you lose, come out and give somebody another chance. This is what we want in this country. Don't fight and you know you lose and you keep fighting and doing that kind of squad and people getting damaged and people getting hurt and all this kind of thing. It's bad for the country. You're destroying the country and you're also destroying the people them. What motivates me to get in a fight for democracy is the wrong things that I saw was going on, right? And I realized that democracy was stolen away from the people, right? So if democracy is stolen from the people, I'm a concerned citizen, right? I don't want that to happen. So I decided not to fight for democracy. And fighting for democracy, it pay off great well. We is a democracy country. We are a democratic country. And if you have one side trying to carry away everything, it's not good for the people. I don't want to see that happen again with no party, PNC, the PPP, or no other party, regardless of who in power. If an election comes and you lose, come out and give somebody another chance. This is what we want in this country. Don't fight and you know you lose and you keep fighting and doing that kind of squad and people getting damaged and people getting hurt and all this kind of thing. It's bad for the country. You're destroying the country and you're also destroying the people them.
Hello there, welcome back to Assault on Democracy Never Again, a reflection on the March 2nd, 2020 general and regional elections. In this hour, I'm joined by Senior Counsel Timothy Jonas, Sonia Parag, Minister of Government, and of course, one of the persons who were very prominent on the television during that 5 months after March 2nd, and Bishop Juan Edgil, no stranger to these discussions, and also Minister of Government. Lady, gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening.
So I wanted to start, Bishop and panel, from a comment I made today. On March 2nd, 2020, I went to the polling station about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was working all morning, and I voted. When I left the polling station, I was proud to display my inked finger. I didn't know at that time that I would have had to wait 5 months, and I would have had to battle almost every night to ensure that my vote was counted and it was counted accurately. I wanted to start from that perspective, and I maybe want to start with you, Mr. Jonas. You have also been almost a regular feature on a number of programs talking about what has been happening, and even during the recount, you would have been at the conference center talking to the press about your observation. But I want us to focus a little bit on March 2nd itself. I wanted to start with you.
Right. Well, I had the same experience as you. I'll go back 5 years before that, 2015, and I voted and went on the seawall and took a picture of my inked finger and put it on Facebook, like I'm sure a lot of people did. And the same thing 2020. You go and you see everything looks orderly and organized, and you internally breathe a sigh of relief, and you hope that everything works well. You vote and hope that you can have confidence in our institutions, and then you wait and see. Of course, 2020 was the occasion of possibly the most crude attempt to undermine democracy, but it hasn't been our only attempt, has it?
I'm going to come to you, Minister Parag. I know you also would have been in the fields. I'm not too sure what time you voted, but the word at that time from almost everyone, including those from the APNU+AFC who were then in government, that the elections were orderly and elections were going smooth. Your thoughts?
Definitely, Eddie. So on the 2nd of March 2020, unassumingly, I also went to my polling station, but I went at 6 o'clock in the morning. And that was right in Queenstown, and I would have been one of those persons who voted without an ID card. So I went through the entire process of my name being called out in front of all of the polling agents and having to sign that form, that oath form, and all of that. Now, I was a candidate to poll on that day as well for the PPPC, and I would have worked in the Unity Mahaika area all day, and it was orderly, it was peaceful, and I had the pleasure of seeing international observers at different points during that day. I myself sat in as a polling agent to relieve my polling agent that I would have trained. So I actually went through a bit of the process. But really, that day was calm, but little did anybody know that that was the calm before the storm. So my experience on that day was great until we had some horrific events taking place after that.
Bishop.
Well, I started my day with great excitement because I was able to post 53 polling agents in the heart of Georgetown, ensuring that every polling station in the Lodge, Wortmanville, Charlestown area had a PPPC polling agent, which was a signal achievement for running an election in Georgetown. And we got that done about 10 minutes to 6. And I smiled, gave my report that we had polling agents in every station, rushed to my polling station at Dynasty, at South Rungveld, voted, and then traveled to Linden to oversee the Region 10 process. Because I was the cluster leader, I had 115 polling agents throughout Region 10 that I had to manage. And so it was an exciting day to ensure that in 2 areas, traditional PNC strongholds, where people had all kinds of fears of working, we were able to recruit, train, and post quality polling agents because we knew the stakes were high, win we must, and we had to get the right people in place. So my day was very exciting. And I voted about 9 minutes after 6, and I got into Linden. I won't tell you the time because that will sell me out in terms of the the speed limit and things of that nature. I don't want to expose myself unnecessarily before the public where that is concerned. But it was an exciting day, and I look forward to voting. But Eddie, what made me more happy that day, my mother-in-law lived with me at that time. She hadn't passed yet. She was 93 years of age. And my son, Juan Jr., took her, literally lift her to the polling station and had her vote. And that was a PPPC vote, a 93-year-old woman who had aged and was not as mobile as she was before. But these elections were so important that she wanted to vote. And when I got the report, Mommy just finished voting and she's back home, that brought me greater joy. And that happened throughout the whole country. People literally turned out. As I traveled the East Bank, the schools along the East Bank corridor, you could see the people line up. Everything was just orderly. I was excited because I know 2018, no confidence motion and all the struggles all the way to March 2nd, having to fight to get an election date out of, I don't want to use the term that I would want to describe, but they are an assorted bunch of special people. And we'll talk more about them a little later. But I was excited about the day.
I deliberately started on what happened on March 2nd, 2020. Today happens to be the first anniversary of those elections. I started from that perspective, and all three of you would have almost said the same thing, that what you observe on elections day, it was orderly, it was very calm, very little reports, even from the observers. You weren't hearing much reports of any issues. But none of us knew that, as you put it, Minister, it was the calm before the storm. It was really a storm. It was 5 months. We saw what observers themselves describe as some of the most naked attempts to derail our democracy and to steal an election. Mr. Jonas, you have been very, very vocal during that period, the 5 months wait. And you have been part and parcel of almost the entire exercise from the Ashman's building. And we're going to go to the specific areas where a lot of stuff happened. Ashman's building, the GCOM headquarters in Kingston, and at the Artichon Convention Center. Overall, you observe almost everything. Your thoughts?
Well, the 2020 elections were, you can't say they were unique, but I think they went beyond previous elections because of the polarization of the voters. It had become, with the merger of the AFC into APNU, it had once again become a two-party race, a two-horse race. And in Guyana, that historically has always been a bad situation. It has boiled us down to our worst ingredients. I think what happened in the run-up to the elections is that both sides told themselves that they could win fairly. And because they genuinely held that belief, there was nothing to prevent the orderly conduct of the elections, which is why we saw what we saw. We saw the GCOM personnel doing their work. We later discovered that there had been some irregularities knitted into the fabric, but we saw them doing their work properly. We saw an orderly result, and the international community, everyone, was impressed with how it was done. And I think the reason for that was that both sides told themselves that the APNU and AFC had won the previous election. The PPP were convinced that the poor performance by APNU in the intervening 5 years would be enough to swing the pendulum, and both sides genuinely thought they would win. So we had an orderly election. The thing is that with the polarization and with the extreme mutual mistrust, when it began to appear that one side was winning, I think that all the rules went out the window.
Interestingly, you spoke about why, in your thoughts, the elections were orderly. And I keep saying, there are events, there were indications even on elections day. And I think somehow, in my personal view, the APNU+AFC knew, even before they went in the election. So I have a bit of a different view based on what you said just now. They knew that they were going to lose the elections. And we can go right back. to pre-elections, but I don't want to go there. They knew that they were going to lose the election. So they were setting the stage even on elections day. They started with all sorts of frivolous kind of excuses as in some of the polling stations. However, because of the vigilance not only of the polling agents of the PPP and some of the other parties that participated in the elections, but also the vigilance of even the observers who were there, who were observing the process. And I want to bring you in here, Bishop, based on what Timothy just said. Your thoughts?
Representing the PPPC, we campaigned to win an election. I'd gone across this country speaking in meetings during daylight hours, night hours, after dark, meeting with groups, focus groups, interacting with people, appearing on television, writing, doing whatever we had to do. And we were campaigning to win an election. I somewhat agree with what my good friend, Senior Counsel Jonas, just said, that the APNU+AFC also felt that they could win the elections. And I was happy that they felt that they could win the elections, because democracy must give people that feeling. But we did not see them work to win the elections. We monitored their rallies. They were busing people from one corner to the next corner to make up crowds. They were hardly motivated the way they should have been motivated. The international community, the international observer groups, in the areas that I monitored, I saw several of them different times during the day, and they expressed good views about the process that was going on, particularly in Region 10, where I spent most of the day, whether it was Wismar or Mackenzie or in the mines or down the rivers, as far as I could have gotten those days, that day, and gotten back to start receiving statements of poll in the night. Things went pretty orderly. And because of that, I felt that it was, everybody had a fair chance. It was just a matter of now getting the vote count. And Eddie, what made me quite confident is that as I sat in our command center in Region 10 and started receiving statements of poll in the night, even though we knew that the PNC had their stronghold in Region 10, we saw our own numbers in Region 10 improving. And you're getting more votes than you got before. So that showed that our hard work paid off, and it was obvious that we had people who traditionally supported the PNC coming the way of the PPP, or people who never voted, voting for us. So the evening, about midnight, when the last Tushau came in with his statement of poll from deep down in the river, and I started to do the math, and then journeyed down about 5 a.m., having gone to the GCOM office at, which is the regional office in Region 10, and got the counting agent to give me the spreadsheet to compare with our actual statements of poll. Yes, they are winning Region 10, but I wasn't looking at who was winning and who was losing. I was looking to see how our votes were improving, because I knew once you replicated that, every part of the country, victory was assured. The people who worked for the election, on all sides, I must say, whether they were the PNC polling agents or observers or the PPP polling agents, every station that I had gone to, I saw a great level of cordiality, respect. There was a decent, peaceful operation. I hardly detected any hostility in the polling stations. The candidates who were canvassing for the polls, getting people with their buses and their cars and checking off the list outside, everybody was in a real good mood. And I felt that that was a day that Guyana was graduating into a maturing democracy, that some of the events of an election day was going to be lost, and we would have gotten rid of that in a new era of just let's go for it and respect the process. That was my feeling for the entire day. When I got home by 6:30 in the morning, the Tuesday morning, and I spoke with my wife, I said, I think we got it. I think we're comfortable. Only to discover that we had to wait 5 months.
Interestingly, Bishop, you brought the point, and I want to bring you here, that by the next morning, I think all the political parties that participated,
They knew who won or who lost.
the results.
Yeah.
Knew the results. What we saw even during the course of March 3rd, some amount of you will call it calm from the APNU+AFC, knowing fully well that they lost the elections, but while they were calm, you were still hearing the narrative of victory, and we can recall, all of us can recall those multiple celebrations of victory that emanated from Lamaha Street ever so often during that period. So I want to bring you in here, Minister. After polling day, you went home. Bishop said he was confident that the PPP won the elections, and rightfully so, based on the statements of poll that you had. Your reflection after elections day and the ensuing days.
Well, what happened is that elections day never really ended for me, because we would have gone to the length of waiting on your polling agents to return with their copies of their SOPs. And based on the SOPs, we were able to tally all candidates and the party to tally the votes. So we knew against the total voters list what our votes were. And so from following the ballot box to the police station and then on to GCOM and so on, led you straight into the morning of the 3rd. And then at 8 o'clock that morning, I entered the Ashman's building to represent the PPPC as their candidate to poll for the tabulation process. And that day, it started out well. And I had all of my statements of polls ready for Region 4, ready and in order. And the other regions were being counted, or most of them were already finished by that time. And we didn't hear of any issues with the other regions. It was when we got to Region 4. And quite frankly, the day of the 3rd did not have any events, so to speak, until later in that day. Later in that day when you started to see some cracks coming out. But then on the 4th of March, is when all of the issues began. I sat there along with the other political parties. You had ANOG, of which a senior council is a part of, members representing them. The PPPC had their members. The APNU+AFC coalition had their members. Other small parties like the TCI, TNM, international observers. The room was filled. And the numbers were calling for boxes in Region 4. And it was not matching the SOPs. So I started to repeat the numbers to the person who was calling. And the room, because of the fact that other parties did not have the SOPs, and it would appear that the APNU was using a spreadsheet. Amazingly, a spreadsheet, which was being also used by the GCOM staff. And numbers were being called, and I kept repeating the numbers, and that is when everyone's attention was brought to the fact that box after box on the East Bank, box after box in Region 4, the numbers were inflated. And that there is where the concern, and there is where you saw the beginning of the collapse of the democracy. And I just wanted to say one thing before I leave this question, or this response to your question, your statement. The PPPC would have campaigned very hard. They would have prepared very hard, maybe way more than they did prior to 2015. And it is from that preparation that you knew that you were bringing in the crowds. as you saw rally after rally, the crowds were there. Now, both parties may have gone in thinking that they would have won, and to some extent I agree with Senior Counsel and I agree with my colleague. But I want to add that my own view is that for the APNU coalition or the coalition party, even if they did not win, and I understand that now, there were systems in place, sinister systems in place for them to win at all costs. All costs. It didn't matter if they collapsed the democracy. It didn't matter if they committed the most heinous violation on this nation by stealing the will of the people or thwarting the will of the people.
Interestingly, Minister, you made the point, and coming back to what Senior Counsel Jonas would have said, I think the indicators were there, the signs were there from the 2016 local government elections, the 2018 local government elections. So I think the then government knew that they were not standing on solid grounds. And I think the foundation was laid even during that period, because they had to know somehow by the morning of the 3rd that they lost the elections. Hence, maybe the spreadsheet which came into play eventually was prepared. I don't think you had to be playing with the numbers for some time to really set, to come up with those figures, having recognized that you've lost the elections already. So, coming back to your question, Senior Counsel, I think the indications were there. I think they knew that they were going to lose the elections. But there was this kind of barefaced attempt to operate and put themselves out as though, they were in control. I mean, maybe because of the sinister plot that you were speaking of.
I smile when I hear Bishop talk about campaigning and the numbers he saw campaigning, and my good friend Ms. Parag is doing the same thing. In 2015, the PPP lost by 5,000 votes. In 2020, when you combine third parties and APNU votes, the PPP won by 5,000 votes. Now, how on earth, when you go out on the road and you look at crowds, who is going to do a head count to think about that 10, 15, even 20,000 swing vote and decide that we are winning this election because of a campaign or because of the numbers of crowds I'm seeing on the road? We are talking razor-thin edges here, very small margins. You're not going to pick up those margins by looking at the size of the crowd. You're going to pick up those margins only when your statements of polls start coming in. Now, I agree with Bishop. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've known Minister Bishop for such a long time. Please forgive the familiarity. But I agree with him that the PPP made inroads, small inroads, in most areas. That's inevitable. Because at the end of the day, in Guyana, you can campaign until you're blue in the face. 95% of Guyanese will not change how they voted. It is that small margin that changes. That margin was represented by the AFC long ago when they were independent. It included me. But that margin was disillusioned with the visionless leadership of President Granger and was disillusioned by what we saw as heavy-handed taxation, poor administrative policies. And we're moving away from AFC, which is why AFC has imploded. They had to go somewhere. And because it was a two-party race, that small margin of truly independent voters, some of them went back to vote PPP, and some of them, stubbornly, including myself, decided we're not voting for either of the two, and decided to vote for a third party. But in terms of a campaign, and in terms of saying we campaigned hard, how many Guyanese do you think voted APNU and heard the wisdom of Bishop Juan Edgell on a platform somewhere and was so inspired that they decided they would vote PPP? We don't do that in Guyana. There's a very small margin of independent voters that will change their vote based on policies. The rest, in every single village that you go along, we all know, and we know this internally, will vote one way come hell or high water. And that's what we saw. The margins are too thin for us to pretend that anything else happened. It was those independent voters that gave the swing, and in my opinion, rightly so, because we saw poor leadership. Unfortunately, when that happened, and here I agree with my friends, They knew the next day. The statements of poll came, and the system is a good system. And by the next day, you knew from those statements of poll what the writing was on the wall, and then you had to figure out, having allowed a fair election to take place, how to wriggle. And I'm afraid the wriggling was so crude that everybody saw it.
Before I bring in back Bishop, because I know you wanted to respond, I just wanted to say, I participated in the elections campaign, and this was not just about, I think when Bishop spoke, and Bishop can represent himself here, but it wasn't just about the crowds that show up, about large numbers. It's a lot about going house to house, door to door, engaging people on a one-on-one basis, and hear from them their concerns. People who you know traditionally voted APNU or AFC, hear from them the hardship that they were facing, their thoughts of how the government was performing, and I think it's more from that perspective, not necessarily when you have the rallies and you see the large crowds turning up, but the interaction on a one-on-one basis with a lot of people across the country. I'll bring you in here, Bishop.
Well, the thing Eddie and Senior Counsel Jonas is making the point, yeah, there is what you call the base. The PPPC has a base, the PNC has a base. And come hell or high water, that base is with you. But campaigning is capturing the imaginations, and it's a battle for mind and soul. And what we in the PPPC did, we did not run a media campaign. Media was important, but we went every street. We had a street captain. Every village, we had a village leader. Every community, somebody was in charge. We got our lists. We canvassed the list. We knew who was living there, who was out of the country. We knew where everybody was located. And we had check-off times, 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, the crucial 5 o'clock hour before polls close at 6 o'clock. So we were there working the fields. Let me say this. I want to congratulate publicly the leadership of the leader of the and General Secretary of the PPP, Dr. Barjavio. An astute politician as he is, a man who could move the crowds at any rally and stir up the fire and get people highly motivated. He was the one who insisted your public meeting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon is your bamboy, so to speak, Guyanese language. You got to get out there in the morning. You got to get out there. We had our people out there. And if the APNU+AFC believed that the PPPC was joking about this election, they were missing it. And that is why there was such a strong fight back, not just from the top, but from the bottom. The hundreds of people who came out and watched ballot boxes, the people who cooked and brought food for the people who were guarding the ballot boxes, the guardians of democracy, the people who rallied throughout this five-month period of that attempt to steal an elections, the people who stayed up all night and looked at those programs and called and wrote and rallied and the rest of it. People were highly educated on what was at stake, not just from the media and the rallies, but from the house-to-house campaign, the visitation, going into those areas. And I spoke, let me give you an example. Since Sidwell's school, I think they had 6 polling stations at St. Sidwell's School, that's Lodge. The PPPC used to get 2 and 3 and 5 votes at St. Sidwell's School. When we brought out 50-something votes out of St. Sidwell's School, you know that St. Sidwell's School, you know you were making some inroads. I mean, it is not 300. Dynasty, where I voted, we used to get 5 and 6. The day I was getting reports from the boys in the street when they heard at the end of the campaign, the night when the statement of poll was posted up and they saw some 40-something people in the box that I voted for the PPPC. They were mischievous PNCites who were trying to look around. Who are the betrayers? Who are the people who sell out? Because their only way of imagining who vote is Edgil and his family, and they're looking to see if anybody look like they're of another race that is not black. But they can't figure out in a predominantly black community 45 plus people in one box at Dynasty voted for the PPPC. It threw them off guard. And you had those kinds of effects, and you go down in a school in Charlestown where you used to get zero, and you picked up 15 votes. So incrementally, we made inroads in every community. And I took on the task of saying congratulations to the General Secretary, Dr. Bart Jagdeo. Because local government elections, when we did local government elections in 2018, he told us, this is the dry run for 2020. This is the dry run. And what we did with local government elections, we went into the city, we went into Bartica, we went into New Amsterdam, we went into Linden. We got no seat, we ended up with 1. We had 3, we moved to 5. Kokwani, we ended up with 6. Georgetown, we moved from 3 to, I think it's 5. Bartica, we ended up. Every area which was considered no-fly zones, strongholds, we put up candidates in mock-up for local government elections. That was the kind of leadership, breaking this myth that it's polarized campaigning, blacks voting for one way, Indians voting one way. We knew we could not have won the 2020 elections with racial voting. We knew we had to go after Guyanese. So whether it was up the creek, in the village, down the back dam, in the high town, on the TV, in the city, with the middle class, with the working class, we went everywhere with our message. And I'm satisfied that I'm sitting, occupying office legitimately, and I use that word very strongly. I'm satisfied that I'm occupying office legitimately, and Dr. Muhammad Irfan Ali is our president legitimately, having worked to win the admiration of the Guyanese people. And no matter how thin the margin was, we got the majority, and that's what a democracy is all about.
I don't want us to dwell too much, and we're sounding as though we're doing a post-mortem of the elections itself. And if I just say before we move on, is the other thing that we have to take into consideration in this discussion, Mr. Jonas and the other panelists, is the fact that the Guyanese people, particularly us, the younger generation, well, I'm not that so much of the younger generation, but I think I'm somewhere in the lower part there, myself and Minister Parag and the others. But we had an opportunity to make a decision and judge 2 things. We had 2 periods, and that was the difference. In 2015, it was a bit different. You had the younger people, you had 23 years of only a PPP government. In 2020, you had the PPP period, and you had a period of the APNU+AFC. And people could have easily judged based on the performance of the 2. You take any 5 years of the PPP, and you took the 5 years of the APNU, and I think that by itself was able to guide the political parties, and I think that from that is also one of the perspectives from which the PPP understood and knew that it had the elections. But I want us to move on from a post-mortem of the elections, but to talk on, and despite all of this that we said, all of the good things that happened on elections day, how all of us were satisfied, things went downhill. Things went downhill when the APNU+AFC clearly recognized that it lost the elections. And we saw all sorts of theatrics. I'm going to bring you in here, Mr. Jonas, starting from the Ashman's building, starting from the evening when the spreadsheet started, then you went on to flash drive being inserted into computers and all sorts of things. You were part of some of those activities, not in the sense you participated, but you were present, if I should say, for some of those activities. Your reflection on those that happened.
I'm happy to answer that. Before I do, I agree with Bishop about the campaigning. A very careful campaign was done by the PPP, a very conscientious campaign, a hard campaign. They won by 1 seat. We have a razor-thin difference. And that 1 seat, and I agree with what you say, Eddie, that 1 seat represents the people disillusioned with what they saw by the APNU government. Now, having had a fair election on the 2nd of March, and by the 3rd, certainly 4th of March, both parties being completely aware of what the outcome was. The outcome based on the ballots cast. A number of things started to happen. And the first was what you talk about with the spreadsheets. Now, the spreadsheets in itself is not sinister, because in each of the areas, the chief officer, the returning officer, uses spreadsheets. It's a shortcut. But you expect the reading from the spreadsheets to reflect the figures you got in front of you.
Right.
That's what happened in regions 1 to 10.
Yep.
It didn't happen in region 4. Now, half of Guyana celebrates Mr. Mingo as a hero. They tell themselves that Mr. Mingo had some wonderful insight and realized that they were being cheated. That kind of storytelling is what continues to polarize us, I'm afraid. Because, first of all, as soon as you examine it as a story, you realize how implausible it is. But it also detracts from what, for me, is the most fundamental issue. Look, anybody that plays sports knows that you find out about your opponent on a sports field. Cricket, football, hockey, squash, tennis, anything you play. You know if your opponent's a cheater. And you respect him if he loses honorably. And you do not respect him if he wins by cheating. I didn't vote PPP. I don't support the PPP. But Mr. Ali is president by virtue of a fair result of an election. And therefore, I congratulated him. The gentleman, as soon as there was a concession, I spoke to him hours later and was very happy to congratulate him. Not because I supported the gentleman or voted for him, but because he won fairly, having fought hard. And that's what should happen. In 5 years, he might not win. But having won, you have to shake his hand, congratulate him. I believe he has the best intentions, and you have to allow him to do his job that a very slim majority of Guyanese put him to do. I don't know why anyone can easily step back from what is a clear, honest position and cheat. It is what polarizes us. It is what removes all real issues of economics, of social needs, of education, of health, all the issues we should be talking about. We don't talk about. What we talk about is those horrible people and these horrible people. And that is why Guyana continues to be where it is. And until we can move away from that, until we can have confidence in our institutions, we will continue to dialogue in the gutter rather than conducting a dialogue at a level that is necessary for any country to meaningfully move forward. And I noticed that it's only when I got here I see that your subtitle on the name of the panel is not just Assault on Democracy, but the subtitle is Never Again. Now, I really hope that I can persuade you that we need to have a discussion on what Never Again means. Because we had a failing in the system, a good system that was undermined by people who intended to defraud it. And you cannot rely on humans because human nature is susceptible to fraud and graft and corruption. We have to make sure the system is intact. And for me, a conversation about Never Again has to be how we can make changes to the electoral system. First of all, to give credence to any allegations that are made as to its defects in the system, problems in the system, but then to fix it. Unless we do that intelligently and with an open countenance, we are going to continue to have a dialogue in the gutter about those horrible people and these horrible people. And we will continue to polarize our society. So I really hope we can move on to fixing the system and a discussion on how that can be done.
I wanted to bring in you here, Minister, but I just wanted to adjust a little correction, Mr. Jonas. I heard you keep saying that the PPP lost by 5,000 in 2015 and by the same 5,000 probably in 2020.
One.
One in the same 5,000 in 2020. May I remind you that I think the APNU got 217,000 plus votes. The PPP got 236,000 plus votes.
And the third parties?
It was almost
And the
about
third
15,000 between the two parties.
And the third party?
No, I'm dealing with the 5,000,
Fortunately,
5,000.
we recorded, and if you go back to what I said if you take the APNU votes together with the third party votes, you will see that the margin was similarly thin.
Fair enough. Yes, I want to bring you in here, Minister Parag, because you were present at the Ashman's building. And you said earlier that you were one of the persons who would have first raised objections when Mr. Mingo started to call numbers that were nowhere close to what was present on what you had in your possession. Could you walk us through that, as horrifying as that experience is, the Guyanese? Could you walk us through a little through those?
You know, I don't quite remember what the 80s were like. I was very young. I was not even born in the 70s. So I really can't say. I just hear stories and people repeating what would have happened to them. And I never thought in 2020 that my generation would experience something even more horrible because of the fact that everything was televised and people did not care that the entire world was looking at them. So sitting there and calling that number, I was confused myself for a few moments because I'm thinking, what am I seeing here? What am I listening to here? But thankfully, we had so many right-thinking persons in the room that everyone started to object. So while I would have called it out because I had the SOPs, everyone stood up right from the inception. International observers, the other political parties, all representatives that were in the room from the PPPC stood up and voiced their objections to what they knew was the beginning of a rigging of an elections. I can't say it. I cannot sugarcoat it. That's what it was. And the fact that I stood there, and many others, I can't speak for what others saw, but what I stood there and looked at when Ms. Valda Lawrence from the APNU came out of that room, walked up that stair, along with, I believe it was Attorney at Law James Bond, right, walked up that stair and shut out everybody else so that her signature can appear on a declaration that was false. The count was not over for Region 4. The law was not followed, and we would have seen that from many court matters ensuing, or the court matter injunction having been filed after that to stop that. We would have seen the ruling of the Chief Justice. We know what it is. It's on record. And what was happening there was something beyond. It is tantamount to raping of a country. It's that kind of violation. It is that kind, because you're no longer standing there for yourself. You're standing there on behalf of 51% or how much ever percent voted for you. And that was the sinking feeling and the helpless feeling that was going through everyone I know who were my colleagues standing there, and every right-thinking person. So, on that particular day where those numbers were inflated, and to have those officers who are supposed to be impartial and who are supposed to carry out not only by their conscience but by law something that is written in the law, that was not done. That was not done. To witness that was just another assault on our legal framework.
The response from those present, not necessarily the APNU+AFC, but those representing the PPP and the other parties that contested the elections, the response was overwhelming. It was an indication. I mean, I haven't experienced the 60s and the 70s, but it was an indication that Guyanese were never willing at that point ever to let a repeat of the days of which we heard and we read about of the pre-92 period in Guyana. So I guess at that point, Senior Counsel, they were saying never again when they stood up and they rejected the position taken by Mr. Mingo. I'm going to go to you, Bishop, and then I come back to Senior Counsel.
Eddie, what was amazing was the bold, brazen, brass-faced attempt. This is the modern age. Cell phones, cameras, technology, people around the world watching. And you're attempting to rig an election, but before we miss this point, Mingo and company at Ashman's building were carrying out the wishes of a group that was assembled elsewhere. And that group showed their ugly head by financing, representing, filing court cases, petitions, carrying us through the mud for the 5 months. Mingo's first move of getting a Region 4 statements of Region 4 declaration passed and added to the other 10 to get a declaration was really to cheat an election, get results declared, and the PPP to challenge those results by way of an election petition after. That was a concoction. And that is why in this debate that is going on in the parliament right now, some of the riggers are unable to really stand up and speak to the issues because they knew and they fully well know the part they played. This thing was bad. You know, I remember appearing on programs with you, Eddie, and we discussed the thing if Granger knew, if he was a part of it, and all the rest of it. But look what happened. That Sunday on the 2nd of August, when he collapsed, everything collapsed. If he wasn't in charge, why the person who was really in charge didn't take over at all material times? There was a hierarchical structure of command and control. We ain't giving up power like this. So they had a machinery in place. Mingo and all the others at GCOM were parties and surrogates of the intellectual authors of this rig. So tonight, Eddie, on the 2nd of March, when I say never again, it's not just never again to an election official trying to declare false results. I'm saying never again to political leaders infiltrating a system to the extent that they could have their plans and surrogates inside there to carry out wishes, with winning at all costs. Because if you have that, then there's no democracy. People must go to jail for attempting to rig an election. And I say this with all sincerity. Rigging an election is not a simple thing that you could laugh at each other and say, well, I get in, y'all got to go and get an election petition now. It is thwarting the will of the people. I started off by telling you my 93-year-old mother-in-law went out and voted. How would a person like that feel to know that you voted? You're going back into those days of when your votes used to be dumped. Soldiers used to come and pick up the ballot box. We have the ballot box martyrs that we celebrate in the quarantine every year. Boxes used to be taken at Queen's College and North Ronville Multilateral School and Bladen Hall and repacked, disappeared, thrown away. People fought and got rid of that. In 1992, we celebrated what was called the return to democracy, where your vote was counted at the place of poll, and a statement of poll is being generated and all the rest of it. And now you have a few people who, after now we're discovering, because of how deep they were in corruption, how deep they were in their stealing of Guyana's wealth, how deep they were in looking after themselves and enriching themselves, wanted to hold on to power at all costs. And they didn't mind using the mingos of this world to carry out their wishes and toward the will of the people. So never again must mean that the Guyanese people must say, listen, we will never again put dishonest, blatantly disrespectful, and rigorous again to run a country. Especially when they campaign on a banner of decency, honesty, and integrity. Because that was fascinating. You are projecting to the whole world decency, honesty, and integrity, and you participated in the rig. And you were the masterminds of the rig. And Eddie, let me tell you, one of my disappointments of the 5 months, I salute people like Timothy Jonas. He was in the recount station with me when I was losing patience. He was there with his calm, patient voice.
Wife and son.
Saying, Madam Officer, and trying to keep it cool to get the point across when all these spurious machinations were being hatched. And I was like, what you guys are trying to do? But you know what? The people who were, there were some people in this country who should never again raise their voices to speak on any matter. Because when it really mattered, they did not speak. When it really mattered, they did not speak. And I don't want to call names because there were some organizations that disappeared. Disappeared, including the church that I'm a part of, the wider church community. They disappeared, apart from the Roman Catholic bishop and a few others, especially in the charismatic Pentecostal church community. They choose to remain silent. In the midst of knowing a blatant rig, but that silence did not start on March 2nd. It started from sins and no confidence motion. People don't want to choose sides and you want to come across as looking as you are unbiased. But if something is wrong, it is wrong. You know how dangerous that is? If we had gone on with that rig, this country would have been under sanctions. You believe we could have been free tonight to sit down and say we're discussing? We don't know. We were moving into a military dictator state because the attempts to use the police and the army to control was starting to surface. People started to use COVID as and the fact that we had a global pandemic that had come to Guyana, they started to use that as a way of controlling people and their behavior and actions. These are not things to be taken lightly. Some of us could have been in jail. I remember right in this compound of where we were broadcasting from, when the recount was supposed to start, and then Valda sent in a crew to say they're fumigating the place that night. And we refused to move because the ballot boxes were already here. Police coming to manhandle you, and Ropes and Ben, commissioner, had to lie down on the ground and refuse to move because what's going to happen to the ballot boxes? I lost many nights of sleep, and I didn't do it alone because we had many colleagues, some from the smaller parties, people like Leonard Schumann and a whole host of others, women included, stood guard to ensure that Guyana's democracy was not derailed, destroyed, and we were not all doomed. And we need to salute all of those men and women who stood up for what is right. And never again must also mean those who choose to remain silent. You must take a warning. When you remain silent, you're doing yourself a harm. Because if we didn't have people who stand up, all of us would have been in trouble.
We have to wrap up this segment, but I want to come back to the whole issue of never again before I give Mr. Jonas and Minister Parag a chance to make the final contribution. I know the angle in which and the direction in which you're going, Mr. Jonas, in terms of your conversation, but I think we can find comfort in the fact that His Excellency himself has repeatedly made the point that the never again to which you speak of reform of the electoral system, strengthening the system to ensure that it cannot be manipulated the way those attempts were made, I think that His Excellency has repeatedly indicated his interest and his desire to ensure that the system is fixed, so never again we experience what we experienced in March to August of 2020. I'll give you a chance for your closing comments, and so are you, Minister Parag.
Sonia raised something that I disagree with, and I want to go there and then answer your question. She said that she, in her fight at Ashman's building, felt herself representing 51% of the population. There's something that I want to say, and it needs to be said loudly and clearly. When democracy is removed, even if you tell yourself you are supporting that party that has fraudulently remained in power, you, the voter, no longer have power. That is no longer your party. That party is king. That party is a monarch. And the next election, you have no power because that party will remain in power. And the next election and the next election, and we saw that with Mr. Burnham. No matter how bad his economic policy, no matter how bad his social policy, Guyana deteriorated from one of the more developed Caribbean countries to one of the poorest next to Haiti. But the government was not answerable to the people because the government was not answerable at election time. So when Ms. Parag was there, 51% of the people were supporting her. But it needs to be said that she was acting for the benefit of the entire country.
Yes,
Democracy is important
for
the entire country.
I agree with you.
Whether you like Ms. Parag and her government or not, if they are there fairly, by a fair and transparent democratic process, you might be able to vote them out next time. But if you have a fraudster in office who is not answerable to you because he's rigging elections, you can't get him out. He could do what he wants. And that is the greatest danger to a country. We saw it. We remain next poorest of Haiti, and there's a reason for it. We deteriorated because of the dictatorship that we suffered. Now, getting back to the system, President Ali is well-intentioned. I've spoken to him often enough that I firmly believe that. But as I've said, we all have feet of clay. And I do not take comfort from any official, any minister, and even the president saying to the people, don't worry, we're going to solve this problem. I will remind you that Mr. Granger used to say he was president of all of Guyana and was inclusive and looked after the whole country, and that he was law-abiding. So the fact that you say so doesn't make it so. We need to have intelligent, rational discussions in fora like this with the people listening so that everyone understands the system and understands the failures in the system and understand how the system can be made better. That is what transparency is about. It gives me no comfort if some official says, we're going to fix it. That is what I hope you can have a conversation about in a forum that everybody can participate. We know one side says the voters list was bloated. Is there any truth in that? If there's truth in that, what caused it and how do we fix it? We know that there was a delay of 5 months because the statements of poll and the results from each place of poll did not get to the public immediately. Although we have internet, you put it up on a door, you nail it on a door as if we're living in the Stone Age. Can that be fixed? Shouldn't there have been a website that it immediately became available for everybody to see, for each news house to see? Yes. We need to discuss the system and how to fix the system so that whether you or me agree when election time comes, the next day we can agree that the elections were fair. That is what we need. We need to stop talking about us and them, and we need to talk about the system. I refuse to allow people to say, all is well, don't worry, this person says that he's going to look after it. That doesn't work. We need to have confidence in our systems. And I hope that you will, as a TV personality, carry a conversation about the system, its failings, its strengths, and how to fix it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Parag, before we close.
Yes, I wish to thank Senior Counsel. And as a matter of fact, I hadn't had the opportunity to congratulate him, but congratulations on your attainment of Senior Counsel. Mr. Jonas made a very good point. When I said 51, I said 51 or how much ever. It means all as well. So, indeed. But my final remarks is that we, the PPPC, wouldn't be here without the assistance of every right-thinking Guyanese, of all the international counterparts who stepped in all the organizations who lend their voice to restore democracy. Mr. Jonas, thank you. I thank all Mr. Schumann, Ms. Ray Lam, Mr. Josh Kanai, all of the persons and all of our supporters. There was an influx of youths as the guardians of democracy. We looked at ballot boxes, we kept an eye, people had no sleep. But most of all, I wish to thank His Excellency, Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, the Vice President, Dr. Bar Jagdeo, our Attorney General, Mr. Anil Nandalal, and I thank them because there were days when us younger politicians were discouraged, were distressed, and we still had to go out and encourage persons and the nation. And they would have pep talked us, they would have sat with us, they would have given us that leadership that we needed at that time, and still today. And so I thank them for that, but I thank the nation for rising up. This is what we need. This is the kind of unity that we need to see in Guyana, for Guyana to become a better place, what we want it to be. And most of all, for those of us who are parents, those 5 months were trying times because you could not imagine, you didn't want your child to grow up in that. And that was motivation enough as well to push with this. So again, I just want to say thank you. This is a date that will be recorded, not for the elections day itself, but for what it represents, the restoration of democracy in Guyana. And I think worldwide we are now known for our strength as a one people. Yes. So
I want to thank you very much, Bishop Juan Ejil, Minister Parag, and of course, Senior Counsel Jonas. And I want to say to you, Senior Counsel, that I heard you just now, and I can assure you that that conversation to which you're looking forward will happen and must happen if we all want to see an electoral process as we go forward that is airtight, at least, and never again we have to go through a period where we looked at what was taking place in front of us and we felt somehow we were going back to days that our parents and our grandparents would have told us about. So obviously that conversation will happen, rest assured. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by a few other panelists. Oh, well, yes, I should maybe give Bishop...
Just greetings and good evening.
No, I'm keeping Bishop, actually. I'm keeping Bishop on the next panel.
And make sure that Guyana comes first. Guyana must come first. We all must fight for Guyana.
Thank you very much. We take a short break, and when we come back, we continue.
I look back at my contribution towards the fight for democracy, and I have very little regret. I think the only major regret that I have is that it took me away from my family for 11 long months. That is coupled with COVID. But I look back at what happened then and what could have happened had we not been in this political battle. I think Guyana would have been on a far different trajectory. I don't say a trajectory upwards, a downward trajectory, where we would have descended into a dictatorship. And I'm very happy, like I said, that my colleagues and I, along with the governing PPP and the international community, all came together and rejected a dictatorship.
The struggles, the sacrifices you made to ensure Guyana remains a democratic nation, would you do it again?
Absolutely, absolutely. It took me a long time to feel 100% Guyanese, and I've said it in my budget speech before that Guyana has never been kind to indigenous peoples. And I came here not to try to change Guyana just for indigenous peoples. The system has to change, and I would go through that battle all over again to change Guyana for all Guyanese.
Prior to the elections being held on March 2nd, what we saw since the passage of the no confidence motion in 2018 disappointed a lot of Guyanese. The behavior from the APNU+AFC coalition, the defiance of the losing the motion of no confidence in the National Assembly, and then going on to defying the rulings of the court. What we saw unfolding, and then what happened on March 2nd, and in the 5 months after that, disappointed a lot of Guyanese and a lot of young people, because we thought, myself included, that the days of rigged election, was over, and undemocratic rule and all of these things was over, and we never thought that we would see that again. But what took place last year is a very valuable lesson, and I think all Guyanese should not take their right to vote lightly anymore. And we should always, when it's time to go out and vote, that we should always exercise our franchise, and we should always value that right to be able to elect a government of our choice.
And of course, the golden question, would you do it again in support of democracy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would do it all over again, because I love my country, and I would have done just about anything to ensure that every vote was counted. And we did do everything, and not just myself. It took a huge team. It took this entire country. Even if you were home just following the events on television, nobody could have really functioned, because all we were thinking about is we need our votes to be counted, and we need a free, fair, transparent result to be declared.
Today marks the 1 year after we went to election, and the Guyanese population went with confidence to the poll, and they voted for the present government, PPPC. And for example, in the Amerindian communities, we had confidence that this government would have returned to government after the hardship we faced during the APNU+AFC government for the last 5 years. So we are happy at this time that the PPPC is back in government, and we will commit, or we will fulfill the promises that we made in our manifesto prior to 2020 election.
Today marks 1 year since our democracy was tried and tested, and it survived. And it's an indication that the people of Guyana would have recognized that it was important for democracy to be maintained. And they fought tirelessly over the 5-month period to ensure that we maintain our democracy that was achieved in 1992. We recall we've had successive elections between 1992 and 2015. So 2020 was a test because of that change of administration. And Guyanese who might have not lived in the 70s and 80s, that would have seen the atrocities and our democracy, our system, political system being challenged severely by the then PNC, would have recognized the challenge that we face in terms of our freedom of choice whenever the PNC is in power. And I think that pushback was relentless, and we managed to get the support as well from our friends and partners, because we would have achieved a level of democracy, or our democratization would have been relatively secured between 1992 and 2015. And that is why when that challenge came in 2020, we were able to push back as a people and as a community of nations within the hemisphere and further afield. And that is an indication that we have achieved greatness in terms of our consolidation process, and I think that the road ahead looks very bright. The future of Guyana is in safe hands with the people being represented by the People's Progressive Party, CIVIC.
I realized that the election results per se was taking too long, right, to come out, for the Guyanese public. And I realized I paid attention to everything that happened after March 2nd election. And I realized that there were some elements in the Ghana Elections Commission which were working. I mean, they're supposed to be an independent, free, and fair body, and they were working in defiance of that mandate. And, you know, when I saw this, it motivated me to become a guardian for democracy, because I do not want to see my country, you know, going through any hardship. I do not want to see this country held hostage anymore, you know, for the interests of one particular party. The country as a whole, I mean, they would have voted and their voice should have been heard. And that should have been reflected, you know, I mean, it did after 5 months, but it should have happened sooner. The voices should have reflected sooner, you know, through their votes.
Welcome back as we continue to examine and reflect on the APNU-AFC's assault on our democracy and the fact that Guyanese will never again allow this to happen. I'm joined in the second hour by Honorable Priya Manik-Chand, the Minister of Education. She was a candidate of the PPC, obviously, in the last elections. Don Singh, social activist, and of course, Gillian Burton-Prasad, politician, trade unionist. Ladies and gentlemen, right, we have an opposite of a panel. The previous panel was two gentlemen and a lady. It seems to be a switch now. So welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
I want us to continue from where we left off, where I left off with the previous panel, and we stopped at March 5th. The attempts, the naked attempts by Mr. Mingo, with the support of Val Lawrence and the others, to declare results that were not reflective of the will of the people, what were on the statements of poll, in an effort to maybe hand the APNU-AFC another term in office, despite them not enjoying the support of the majority of Guyanese. I want to start with you, Minister Manik-Chand. You've been part and parcel of that process, trying to fight off, to stave off the APNU-AFC's repeated attempts to rig the elections.
So I wasn't hearing you before, but thanks for having us here, Eddie. It's 1 year since we have had the actual election, and election day went very well. Election day had no hiccups, we had no problems. It was a peaceful day. People went, they exercised their franchise, they chose, and then it was for us to get a count. By as early as before dawn the next morning, the PPP had known that we had won the election. We have the statements of poll, we have people in all the polling stations. So we knew, just like the APNU knew, they also had people in every polling station. So they knew the results of the elections also. They're both large parties with very good network to get information out. By the 5th, so you said you're at the 5th. By the 5th was the day that you heard all the screaming. No, no, no. And trying to get Mingo to stop, because the 4th was when he had his fake heart attack and went to the Georgetown Hospital. The 5th is when he came back in, and despite promises made by Lowenfield in the wee hours of the morning of the 5th that we will begin again where we left off, tabulating the SOPs as is required by law, and we would not stop until we had concluded that process, and that process would give rise to the election results. That was abandoned. Lowenfield lied to us when he said he was going to do that. And Mingo turned up and attempted in the room. Now you have to, so someday we should probably make it a monument so people understand what really happened here. This is a glass room. And I mean a glass room. It's a room that had glass walls. So everybody could see what this man is doing, and the most open attempt to rig an election. In fact, and I think a prime minister said he'd never seen, a regional prime minister, such a transparent attempt to rig an election, to alter results. He didn't say rig an election. So you could see him go in the room. We're outside. You're seeing him, and you see a commotion started in the room and a big outburst. That was Mingo attempting in that room to declare results that he had not tabulated votes for, that he had not verified. So he was run out of there. That's the morning of March 5th. Came out, went upstairs, and I think by 11:30 in the morning, the famous balcony scene, where he came onto the balcony and proceeded to do something which at that point we could not have known what it was, because you couldn't hear him. We suspected strongly he was attempting to do what he was attempting to do in the room, which is to declare the elections in favor of the APNU+AFC. We couldn't hear him. There was no accompanying document. Nothing was said to us. Later in the afternoon, results would be published based on these fake numbers. And so that was the 5th. By mid-afternoon, we had secured a court order to stop Mr. Mingo from declaring elections results without complying with the laws, which required him to use the numbers on the statements of poll to declare the election results. That court order, which was made by Justice Narvindra Singh, and we mustn't forget these names. These are the champions of democracy who stayed in their offices and did the right thing at the right time when it was necessary. Justice Singh was wrongly abused by the APNU+AFC and their supporters, but his order was upheld all the way through by every other judge that looked at it. And so that order staved off any further action by Mr. Mingo and the APNU+AFC. You would recall that is the morning that Valda Lawrence wanted to beat up people on the stairway. And in that room, and let us call their names also, in that room, sitting and watching Mingo do what he was doing, was Valda Lawrence from the APNU+AFC, Basil Williams from the APNU+AFC, Nicolette Trotman from the AFC, and some other, Christopher Jones and James Bond. They were all in the building looking on at this election being actively rigged, and did not have the decency, any of them, to stop it from happening. Later that day, you would know that there was a denial of access to the chairman of GCOM, and that story has now been written into history. But Eddie, we cannot forget these days. That was a horrific time. You know, the incredible thing about features like Facebook and apps like Facebook is that on the 5th, it will come up again, and they will not be able to hide from this. This is their record. This is their legacy. And when we say never again, that's what it means for me. Never again must we have a political party or any person who feels comfortable to think they can do this in front of the eyes of the world. And I say that, when I say in the eyes of the world, you had cameras rolling, video cameras filming everything that's happening here. Everybody had their phones on, filming everything that's happening here. And the representatives from our allies and friends around the world, the A, B, C, E countries, Americans, British, Canadians, European Union, other ambassadors, observers from the various observer missions, the Commonwealth, the CARICOM, Carter Center. These are the eyes of the world. This happened in their presence. So any political party who feels comfortable doing that, never again means for me that they must never again see executive office and executive power where they can ever try to perpetuate this on us again. I know I have to hand this over to my colleagues, but I just want to point out, this was the one time the APNU+AFC, particularly the PNC, had to show us that they were not the same PNC of old, who every time they had to run an election, they rigged it. This is the time they had to show us that. And they showed us that they're incapable of changing. So you don't want to see more. Never again means never again to anything, any composition, any party that has the PNC in it. Never again.
I'll bring you in here, Don. And of course, Minister Manik-Chan, I think she's set the stage now for us to take the discussions a bit further. Because we have to move from the spreadsheet, we're heading closer to the bed sheet, yes. Which is the other attempt. But I'm going to bring you in here, Don, before I take Gillian, and then we come back to take it further.
Right.
But before we get to the bed sheet, spreadsheet, and the mingo bingo, I just want to reminisce for just one quick second. Me and Marcel Gaskin were standing outside of Freedom House at 4 a.m., 4:15 a.m., and we were just having a conversation. And says, "All right, so well, we're gonna have some change. We're gonna finally get this country back on track or whatever." And he turned to me. He says, "Don, that's not going to happen." And I'm like, "Marcel, what are you talking about? What is this process?" And he says, "Granger is not going to give it up." I says, "Marcel, what are you talking about?" He says, "This is a dictatorship, and this is what dictatorship is." So I asked him, I says, "What are we going through this process for?" He says, "We're going to go through this process, and then we're going to have to fight." And those words were so prophetic. I mean, they just came so absolutely true. I just thought I'd mention that. I mean, it was so pivotal for me to hear it and to reflect upon it, even now a year later, and then here we are a year later. What was enamoring for me was how the Guyanese people stood up. I think at some point, I wouldn't even go say APNU+AFC and all this nonsense. It was the PNC. At that point, for me, as a social activist, as a member of the civic component of the PPP, this was all about, this is the reverting back to the PNC I had known from the 70s and 80s. And this was authoritarian. This was the PNC stamping their power down on you, or attempting to do that. But the people this time stood up. We were not intimidated. We did not take bullying. We, on social media, people stood up. There was a movement called the Gardens of Democracy, where we decided, on the very first night, to start looking at the containers with the ballot boxes. And there were many nights that they tried to intimidate us with whether it be dogs or armed policemen or in whatever fashion. But everybody just smiled. We just says, "Hey, we're here to watch your ballot boxes. We're not here to interact with you. We are not here to fight with you." And we just stood strong. And the people of Guyana stood strong with us because they knew what was happening. They absolutely knew what was happening. We can go from to the bingo, to the court cases, to the dirty bed sheet, to the ridiculousness that the PNC tried to force down our throats. But for me stood out last year is the people of Guyana standing up and saying, "No, we will not stand for it. We want democracy and we will fight for it."
Interestingly, you raised a very critical issue, and I've listened to Freddie Kissoon and the others who were in a previous panel, raising the whole issue of how Guyanese responded, and the fact that there was a demonstration, before I bring you in, Jillian, that the never again we see here, even after the elections and the attempts to rig the elections, Guyanese stood up and say, "Never again we're going to allow a PNC of pre-1992 to take control and to bully us." I think that is where, since then, the never again maybe started, where Guyanese stood up and they rejected. You had people turning out in their numbers to guard the ballot boxes. You had people out there showing support. On social media, like you mentioned, people were rejecting all the attempts to rig the elections. I want to bring you in here.
Before you go to Jenny, just give me like 30 seconds. Having mentioned that, the amount of support, you'd get calls every single day. "Hey, you guys need some juice, you need some water, what do you need?" And it was just an outpouring of never again. Stop this. I can say this because I lived in the 80s. I remember you could not speak because you had to whisper. Burnham. You had to whisper. You could not speak freely. I remember that vividly. So when people kept reaching out to me and saying, "Don, do this, do that, you're a great job," we will not stand for it. We behind you 100%. Maybe we can't come to the front, but just know that we are there with you.
I bring you in there, Jillian.
Okay, Eddie, for me, Priya was in that room, getting it blow by blow. I was on the outside looking in, so to speak. And to go back a bit to March the 2nd, today's date, 1 year ago, the very demonstration of strength and the positive attitude of the people to stand up to demand that never again they will allow their freedom and their democracy to be taken from them. It was expressed on that very March the 2nd from then on. And I say so because when I arrived at my place of poll at around 6:30 in the morning, I could not believe the depth of the lines that were there. And this was by people old and young. And it said to me then, these people mean business. And why would they have meant business? Because what happened after 2015, the way in which we were treated as a nation, the disrespect for the rule of law, the disregard for the Constitution, all of that Guyanese would have looked at and they made the decision. Now coming back after March the 5th and there onward, what we saw was a blatant, unashamed attempt by a political party and its leaders to stamp on the will of the people, to trample on their democracy. That is what they did. And what is the will of the people? Coming together collectively with one opinion that they want to go in this direction and they want to be led by this group of people. The PNC, and I agree with Don, it's the PNC. I don't look at APNU and AFC. It's all a mixture. It's the attitude of a PNC. And I say so because I've worked as a candidate, I've worked as an activist, I've worked as a polling day agent for many, many years. And if you do that kind of work, you know what comes out of the PNC. It's a kind of DNA kind of thing. Their birthright to rule the people of Guyana. They don't feel any other political party has the right to rule this country except them. So the attitude of what we saw of Valda Lawrence and Christopher Jones and Basil Williams, this is something that they tell themselves they had a right to. And come what may, they were going to do whatever it took, by any means possible, to remain in power. And who else to help champion their cause? By David Granger, who was their presidential candidate. Love it, go, do your thing, but I'll stay in the back and watch it all unfold. That is what happened. And I'm saying that Guyanese looked at that and they were disgruntled, they were disappointed, and I cannot imagine what was going through the minds of these leaders to do something like that in this day and age when technology is so upbeat. And March the 2nd and thereafter, up to August the 2nd, when we had a new president sworn in, Dr. Irfan Ali, we must never ever forget again that this blatant attempt that was made to take our democracy away from us was done by a group of people who did not care, who normally would say to you when you leave their grouping and go to another grouping, you sell your birthright. So as far as they're concerned, it's their birthright to remain leaders of the country.
But one has to be a little careful, Eddie, with saying it's the PNC alone. Let me tell you why. I don't think we have any doubt about the PNC's position on this. The PNC was Valda Lawrence and Eve and Granger and Aubrey Norton and even the younger generation, which for me was just heartbreaking. The younger guys, James Bond and Jones, Christopher Jones, and all these young people that really, we have different political views, but there's space for all of us. Not anymore, but I mean, that was my view. The AFC members had a chance to separate themselves from that, and they did not. They did not. In that room, when Mingo was first attempting to announce that, was Nicolette Trotman. She's from the AFC. When there was the shouting trying to get to the chairman, she's from the AFC. Kemraj Ramjatan, Moses Nagamutu, Jorita Fernandes, I'm not sure who she represents or what's her constituency. these are all people who claim to have been the middle ground. They're going to be the balance of power. They're going to be the reasonable set of people. Kathy Hughes, Nigel Hughes. These are all people who run down the rigging of an election. Now, rigging an election sounds like a fancy thing. What they tried to do was to take away from people that freedom to choose a government, that freedom to hire and fire a government because they believe they're entitled and they know better. And so I don't want us to go away with this thing that it's the PNC, the AFC, or whatever is left of them. They were fully involved in that, and they must never, ever, ever come to you again and tell you anything about, to the Guyanese people, about them being righteous or good or capable. We saw what has been unfolding, all the contracts they gave themselves and the things they took for themselves and so on. But that moment, they had a chance to separate themselves out from that level of corruption, that level of rot, and they did not. And so we must not let them off the hook because they are equally responsible for this. Things would have changed if that political party had said early on from the 5th to hold up here. I didn't see these SOPs. I would like to see the party's SOPs because they went together as one party. And if it does not add up to what Mingo and Lowenfield is attempting to declare here, then we will separate ourselves from you. And we will say that we absolutely cannot do this. All of them, from Granger to Nagamutu to Kemraj, and this is their legacy, we mustn't forget it. This is what we must remember them by. They were willing to go and be sworn in and enjoy power that the people of Guyana did not want them to have. And we mustn't forget that.
And of course, you brought up a very, very important issue, Minister Manikchand. And of course, they had the opportunity to separate themselves. I think the only person is Mr. Gaskin.
And that was commendable. But you know, they had the opportunity and they saw examples of it. When Don was saying people and Jillian, people came forward. A lot of the people who turned up to do ballot boxes, look at ballot boxes and guard and brought food and drinks and items for the pot. Yes. And spray for mosquitoes and so on. Those are not people who are necessarily sympathizers of the PPP or even love the PPP. What they like is their right to pick one or the other and to change their mind if they feel like.
I mean, Timothy Jonas made the point, Senior Counsel, moments ago about his position with the PPP, but why he chose a particular route.
Right.
Standing up for democracy, standing up for right. But if we can fast forward, because I know we've been talking all day about what transpired between March 2nd and August 2nd, the attempts by Mr. Mingo again on the 13th of March to manipulate the results despite a ruling by the Chief Justice and all that happened. But over the period, we are celebrating the first anniversary of the elections, and it wasn't historic elections, depending on what transpired after. Even now, we are still seeing attempts by the PNC and the AFC to rewrite history, to stare this nation in the face, to say to the people of this country and to the world by extension that what you are talking about happened between March 2nd and August 2nd never happened. We're hearing that kind of narrative. How do we respond to that? How do we take, especially the younger people in those political parties, serious and look at them as leaders of the future?
Right. So I think they're being destroyed. I think that's unfortunate. I think we had a very old set of leaders in the last government cabinet. I think the average age was 70-something. They were very old people. And this new bunch here, they're destroying them. They will never be taken seriously. They're incredible. They cannot be trusted. They are lying openly. They are telling people things that people know not to be true. They are going to be spending the next 5 months, every day people's Facebook feeds will pop up with stories that happened at the APNU. The young people there are telling you it didn't happen. So they're not going to be believable. Now here's the thing, Eddie. When you take away our right to pick a government and you rig an election to stay in government, you don't need to serve. You see, the people of Guyana need to vote for us. We know that. We'd like to win again in 2025, which means that every day we feverishly try to serve the people of this country. Because I know if we don't do these things we promise to do, and if I don't reach people, and if I don't deliver services, and if I don't give the 15,000 cash grant, and if we don't make sure children get trained teachers, and if we don't make sure health supplies reach people, they'll vote us out. So we're forced to serve. That's what political parties do. They try to stay in office by serving. Now, if you know you're going to rig the election, then you don't have to serve. And that's what we saw in the last 5 years. Nothing done educationally, nothing done in health. The agricultural sectors destroyed, dismantled our traditional economies in the agriculture sectors. They don't need to win your vote because they knew in 2020, we don't need your vote. You don't have to like us. You don't have to feel comfortable that we served you well because we're going to take the election anyway. And that is the danger with allowing a rig to succeed. You lose any power and leverage each citizen has with their vote. And that can't be allowed to happen. If we thought we could rig, we won't have to serve, and we can't do that.
I'm done.
Eddie, the problem is lies. Lies, lies, lies. They are piling lies upon lie upon lie upon lie. 217,000 people voted for the PNC or APNU+AFC, whatever minister would like to call. I'll stick to PNC because it's the PNC attitude and whatever. 217,000 people voted for you. And you have said, and various former ministers and now MPs have gone on record as saying that the SOPs that they have match the numbers that Mr. Mingo came up with. But yet, they have not produced said SOPs. Now, you're telling 217,000 good Guyanese folk to believe in you blindly without a shred of proof. And then you have, I mean, I laugh because you're creating I'll be raw, Eddie. You have a bunch of clowns. You have a bunch of clowns creating these Facebook pages, and I'm sorry, I might get sued, but you have Sherrod Duncan, you have Chris Jones, you have Juretta Finance, and they're coming up with all these fanciful things that have no basis, no fact, and they're just hoping to have just like a face wash, like look at what the right hand is doing, but don't look at the truth, which is the left hand. And it's been crazy, and it's been going on too long. I don't understand how a political party can survive with telling their people lies, because even with the election petition going on, those lies will eventually bear truth. And then you will have pie in your face for 217,000 that you're lying to people. I mean, up to today, I was just browsing social media, and they're talking about ballot boxes and statutory documents. And, I responded to a few. It's like, Mr. Mingo, the Region 4
returning officer,
he directed these people to do this. And we have video proof that all these documents are with GCOM. These things have been debunked. All the lies, the dead people get up and vote. I mean, there's a video circulating with Amna Ali, which is very sad, very, very, very sad for this good daughter of Guyana to be in such a situation. I mean, I really can't. But it's so sad. So I do not know where the PNC is going or where they will go. I will say never again, because you cannot build a foundation on this pillar of lies, pillar of salt that they've put themselves in, and then you have these clownish people trying to build upon it, and there's just no foundation. And in the coming COIs that I know will come along in a few years, they're what they attempted to do will be shown why they attempted to do what they did. Or try to do. Sorry. We have already seen so many land deals. We've seen so many. I saw something tonight with scholarships. Simona Brooms apparently got a $50 million Guyana scholarship of sorts. there was a few others like some Troy Brooms. I don't know who that is. Sounds like a relative, but 30 million Ghana dollars. These are taxpayer dollars. But I know we got limited time, so I won't go on and on and on. But for me, it's the lies and the continued lies that you cannot sell to a nation that is now awake and awoke and have seen and will not forget what you tried to do to this nation. You tried to steal their freedom. You tried to steal their democracy. You tried to steal their children's democracy. My daughter is 21 years old. You tried to steal her democracy. And I'll tell you one thing before I hand over to Jillian. Every night I left my house, to whether it was to go look at the containers or to go do any kind of activity, I says, honey, I may not come back tonight. I may not come back tonight because I don't know what forces they have out there. I mean, I had cars parked in front of my house, all kinds of things. And she looked at me, she says, you know what, I understand what you're doing. That's good, Dad. I understand what you're doing. If you don't come back, I love you, and that's fine.
Eddie, it's sad that the circus continues. And it's sad because we have a lot of young people who should be now preparing for leadership to take up their roles as leaders, responsible leaders in Guyana. Sad to say the coalition has not been able to produce such persons. What they have done is take a group of young potential leaders and put them in a sack and dumped them into the Atlantic. So they're going to go to the bottomless pit. We will now see a vacuum of leadership created, not by the PPP Civic, because what we have been doing, as we said on the campaign trail, we were going to put a lot of young people in our parliaments, to put them in leadership positions, because you know what? We believe in succession planning. We believe that the only way your legacy could continue, your work could continue, your good works, not bad works, the good works could continue, is if you start to allow young persons to put their foot in the mud and carve their own niche. Let them feel the mud between their toes. Let them get practice, and by practice they learn. And then you will see good leadership emerging as the years go by. It's sad when we look at what is going on from the coalition side. They have definitely devastated and destroyed a generation of leaders. Because it's not only those that they have put in parliament, there are those outside who are still doing political work for them, and there are those who are supporters of theirs that are looking on. But I'm happy that Guyana is at a place where our young people don't take what you say for granted. They go and they research and they have their discussions. And, you know, it's sad when you have to hear other young people talk about what is going on in the country, and when they look at other young leaders who should be guiding them and taking the stance for them, what they are doing. And, you know, what we saw after March the 2nd and March the 5th in those 5 months, we have to say hats off to those young persons who we granted the privilege and we gave them that honor of being guardians of our democracy. They were out there every night, all through the day. Because you know why? They believed that where they voted and the party that they voted for is the party that they wanted to see lead Guyana. And so they were determined and steadfast to ensure that that democracy, that privilege that they had to do that act, to vote for the party of their choice, it wasn't taken away from them like years ago, because they would have grown up hearing stories of what happened in the past. So we have to say hats off to those young men and women who stood out there and in the various areas they worked. The older ones who went out there and supported. Persons like myself who went out there some nights and, you know, you sat with them and gave them that courage to continue to do the work. It's very important. And that is why we're here as a political party, as the government of the country. Because I often say, our party does not make promises. We present possibilities for you to take your life forward, and that is what the average Guyanese need.
Thank you very much, Gillian. I'm going to give you a minute, Minister, to wrap up, but I just want to add to what was said just now, because, and importantly, one of the things I think the 5 months has really demonstrated to Guyanese, particularly after the attempts at those declarations, and when we had that little period between the final declaration, or the final fourth declaration, and the recount, is the unity, how Guyanese united, regardless of which political party they supported. Because I can tell you, a lot of people who were supporters of the APNU+AFC, who voted APNU+AFC, when they saw what was happening after March 5th, thereabout, they regretted what they did. And they were there supporting, whether behind the scenes, like you said, Dawn, many of them are coming to you to say, look, we're with you guys, because we recognize that we made a mistake. We recognize that we're going to face what our parents and our grandparents told us pre-1992. So the unity, I think it was a watershed moment for Guyana, particularly among young people. Minister, I'll give you the opportunity.
It was, and I think what happened was people felt the power we had, we used in 2015 to put you, APNU+AFC, in office. I mean, there's an election petition pending about whether that really happened. But for the purposes of these discussions, let's say the people used their power to put the APNU in office, AFC, and watch them for 5 years muck it up totally. Did not serve people. Total useless ministers who just sought to look after themselves. Didn't try to do anything for people. And the people were trying to use that same power to remove them and install another party, not necessarily because you love these parties, you know. You love yourself. You want to see your life get better. The human beings, citizens of this country, want to see their children's lives get better. And they're using their vote to try to do that. And they saw that power being taken away from them. So what would have happened if the APNU+AFC had succeeded in that attempt to rig the election? It would have taken away from the population their power to speak through their votes. And people didn't like that. And so even people who did not vote for the PPP in that time rose up against what was happening. And in the same way that I named people earlier as being really the crafters and the innovators of this attempt to rig, and who must be shamed, we should also name the Dominic Gaskins and the Supriya Singhs, who stood up in that moment and said, not me. You know, this morning someone shared with me Ms. Chomley's letter, where she wrote, and I think she's Cathy Hughes' stepmother or relative, where she wrote in the paper, look, I watched you say stupid things. I watched you with the no confidence motion. I watched you as you tried to tell us all kinds of foolishness, but I will not stay quiet. I will shout with everything in my being that you are not going to steal my vote. Let the people's vote be counted. Good people across this country from various parties stood up. And I want to say with clarity and without any hesitation or reservation that the moment we took that oath, President Ali, Prime Minister Mark Phillips, Vice President Bar Jagdeo, and all the ministers, we became a government for all of Guyana. It didn't matter how you voted. It didn't matter whether you stood against this or not. We do believe, though, we have a deep obligation as human beings, citizens of this country, never to let people forget that, because it would have been, we would never have been able to recover from it. This country would never have been able to recover from leadership that saw themselves as being installed and ensconced into office forever. Because like I said, there would have been no need to serve, which is what happened over the last 5 years.
Thank you very much, Honorable Priya Manikchand, Minister of Education, Don Singh, social activist, and of course, Gillian Burton, politician and trade unionist, for being here this evening. And to our viewers, we want to say thanks for being part of this program. Over the next few weeks or so, we will continue to reflect on what transpired between March and August of 2020, when attempts were naked to steal our democracy. So we want to say thanks for being part of the program, and have a good rest of the evening. Bye for now.